Hi, everybody. We'll be starting in just in a few seconds here, just letting everybody join the call. All right. Well, hello and welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this webinar on natural history collections and repatriation beyond NAGPRA. NAGPRA, of course, is the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. A previous webinar that we organized last year covered repatriation under NAGPRA in the context of natural history collections, and the program today will focus on repatriation issues outside of NAGPRA's scope and delve into both zoological and botanical case studies of ethical return. My name is Jyotsna Pandey. I serve as the Executive Director for the Natural Science Collections Alliance, or NSCA, and Community Programs Director for American Institute of Biological Sciences, or AIBS. And today's event is co-hosted by AIBS, NSCA, as well as Spinach, which is the Society for Preservation of Natural History Collections. And so today's event is co-hosted by all three organizations and has been organized by an ad hoc planning committee of representatives from the three hosting organizations as well as other interested members of the community. So this group of individuals essentially came together with the goal of organizing an educational program on a topic that is extremely important and complex and requires thoughtful discussion and engagement. So we're glad that you're joining us live today and hope that you will share the recording of this program with your interested colleagues who weren't able to join us live. Before we start, just some housekeeping. The program is being recorded, as I mentioned, and will be posted online. Please feel free to use the chat feature on Zoom to share any comments that you have and to introduce yourselves. We'll have an audience Q&A session after the presentations, so please use the Q&A feature on Zoom to type in your questions for the speakers. And if you'd like to pose your question or comment verbally, you can use the raise hand feature and we can unmute you if needed. And finally, please contact our IT support, Diane Bosenjak, who's on the call, if you have any technical difficulties. So we will be hearing from an excellent panel of speakers today. Jan Bernstein and David Mishner will start us off with some introductory remarks to provide context. Jan is founder and managing director at Bernstein and Associates, NAGPRA Consultants, based in Denver, Colorado. And David is a curator at the University of Michigan Matei Botanical Gardens and Nichols Arboretum. We'll then get into a zoological case study of cultural care to be presented by Natalie Patton, who is curator of collections at the University of Denver Museum of Anthropology. And this will be followed by a botanical case study of ethical return, which will be presented by David Mishner, Veronica Passfield, and Shiloh Maples. Veronica serves as a museum consultant and NAGPRA officer for the Bay Mills Indian community, and Shiloh is a Anishinaabe seed keeper and a citizen of the Little River Band of Urawa Indians. I will now hand it over to Jan and David to provide an introduction to this topic.
Thank you, Jyotsna. Would you please change the slide? Thank you so much. So before you go beyond NAGPRA, first ensure compliance with the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. NAGPRA is a federal law enacted 35 years ago. NAGPRA is codified as Indian law and criminal law. The part codified in Indian law, 25 USC, has provisions for existing and new collections. It also includes a provision for discoveries and excavations on federal lands and tribal lands on or after November 16, 1990. The regulations associated with the part of the Act codified in Indian law were updated 2 years ago. They're located in 43 CFR Part 10. My first piece of advice to you is to read the law and the updated regulations. NAGPRA is a federal property law and a human rights law. It is also administrative law, providing processes and deadlines. Next slide, please. Two groups must comply with the law. Museums must comply, and federal agencies, except for the Smithsonian Institution, must comply. Museums are institutions that have received federal funds and have possession or control of holdings or collections that may include Native American human remains or cultural items. Next slide, please. Native American human remains and cultural items are covered by NAGPRA. The definition of human remains was expanded in the updated regulations. Cultural items are defined as funerary objects, both associated and unassociated, sacred objects, and objects of cultural patrimony. Next slide, please. There are 3 groups withstanding under NAGPRA. These groups have the legal right, among other things, to request repatriation, engage in consultation, and determine if a holding or collection is a cultural item or contains a cultural item. The groups withstanding are lineal descendants, the 574 Indian tribes currently recognized by the United States government, as well as any other tribe recognized in the future. They will also have standing, and Native Hawaiian organizations, of which there are currently about 100. Next slide, please. The updated regulations, among other things, outline processes. Duty of care is a new regulation. It requires museums and federal agencies to implement that regulation not only for cultural items and human remains in the possession or control of the institution or agency, but also for those cultural items and human remains that are in their physical custody. Each museum and federal agency with possession or control of collections or holdings that may include an unassociated funerary object, sacred object, or an object of cultural patrimony was required to submit a summary no later than November 16th, 1993, and then to invite consultation. A museum with natural history collections may or may not have included a general description of the collections from the other ologies beyond archaeology. It could be that back in 1993, no one thought that a biology or a geology collection, for example, might include a cultural item. Inventories describe Native American human remains and associated funerary objects and are developed in consultation with those who have standing and an interest. Transparency is created through the publication of Federal Register notices. Notices provide an opportunity for others with standing to consider requesting repatriation or requesting consultation before the legal transfer of control has occurred. Next slide, please. So how do you know what is and is not covered by NAGPRA in your natural history collection? You do that through consultation and by relying on traditional Native American knowledge. Next slide, please. Once you've gone through the NAGPRA processes and you know that the federal law does not apply, you may consider proceeding with a voluntary or ethical return. Advanced preparation is strongly advised. Ideally, you would want to adopt a policy and develop procedures, possibly in consultation with Indian tribes and/or Native Hawaiian organizations. And that policy and those procedures would take transparency into account to help ensure that no one is disenfranchised, no one is left out of the process. David, I invite you to continue our presentation.
Thank you, Jan. And next slide, please. Plants have cultural relationship networks. Our records, whether herbaria, ethnobotany departments, or botanical gardens, as where I am, have only a fraction of the records that relate to cultural relationship networks. Most of us want to go to the last word on this slide, actions, when we go into Beyond NAGPRA. But before that, there has to be knowledge and knowledge sharing. And before that, there has to be a clarification of responsibilities within the plant relationship networks. Next slide, please. So the image that we just had of some from the University of Michigan Museum of Anthropological Archaeology is a good example of my training in a botanical garden world where everything we accessioned was a thing. It has no rights. But what if in a relationship network, there are reciprocal rights and responsibilities of what we have accessioned has ethical rights and responsibilities to the peoples that know it. In the picture here, Elder Sidney Martin on the left is looking at a corn that was removed from a woman whose garden she knew when Sidney was a child, and she has never seen the corn since. Next slide, please. So once we come to a realization that ethical action may be required because there are mutual responsibilities between that which we have accessioned and the peoples who know them, what is it we do next? And what we have here down at the museum is a project that was funded by an external agency as a pilot to bring experts in from within the museum in the museum context. Dr. Scott Heron on the left one in green, Dr. Lisa Young on the right, and Shannon Martin, Anishinaabe negotiator and planner, about what could we actually do. Next slide, please. NAGPRA is ultimately about the museum's intent of what does it want to do, and will it put the resources to do to reprioritizing responsibilities that are inherent to the collection as understood by the tribe or tribes, be completely transparent with what it has in its knowledge sharing without being extractive and asking the tribes or the communities to complete the records. That's not the process of this part of the relationship. And then come up with actions of ethical return. The panels, the two cases ahead will present these and some of these concepts in both zoological and botanical examples. The examples are quite different. And Natalie Patton will start us off with the next one.
Hello, everyone. So I wanted to start with an example that happened in 2022. So in 2022, a sacred white buffalo called Big Medicine was returned to the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. Big Medicine had been on display at the Montana Historical Society since 1961. He was not part of a repatriation request under NAGPRA, but rather was a voluntary return. Indian Country Today has a really great article about Big Medicine if you want to learn more about his story. But I mention Big Medicine now as an example of the voluntary return of an animal ancestor. Today, I'll be sharing how zoology collections can better care for the animal remains that they house through consultation. Next slide, please. The considerations, recommended steps, and one of the examples I'll be sharing today come from Chance Ward's paper toward legal, ethical, and culturally informed care of animal remains in American museum collections. I am one of the non-native co-authors on this paper, and Chance will be joining us later as part of the panel to help answer questions. But I am presenting today because so often our Indigenous colleagues are the ones who are inundated with requests for presentations, talks, and education. This additional labor often falls on them. So I just wanted to acknowledge that today and implore everyone to learn more about what tokenization is and how it happens. Next slide, please. I wanted to share this quote from Heather Harris. "The dead must be treated with respect because they remain a vital part of the living world. Whether an ancestor died recently or long ago, in the Indigenous perspective, they are relatives, and relatives are loved and must be cared for. They can never be thought of as specimens, data, or archaeological materials. So I do want to mention that there is no such thing as a single overarching Native American theology. Spiritual beliefs vary from tribe to tribe, and this is why consultation matters with individual tribes, Native Hawaiian organizations, and Alaska Native corporations. Indigenous scholars Heather Harris and Vanessa Watts, in their work on Indigenous worldviews, Indigenous place thought, and human and non-human agency, have identified some shared or common perspectives on the relationship between humans and animals that does provide a good starting point for this discussion. In some Indigenous cosmological frameworks, both humans and non-humans have agency. They are both active members and contributors to society, and some tribes have histories of interspecies treaties and agreements. Animals are not specimens or data or other. They are ancestors and relatives to many people. In contrast, Western binaries of human versus animal strip animals of their personhood. So it's important to keep in mind that animal remains are a form of cultural heritage and do have the same ethical obligation for stewardship in culturally appropriate ways that are determined through working with Native communities. Next slide, please. When you are starting to consult on your collections, there are some things to keep in mind. First, the words we use matter. When you're consulting, ask if the tribe has preferred names for the animals themselves or how they should be referred to. The word specimen does have a long history of use in museums, but some preferred terms could include ancestor or relative or something else. It's okay to ask what the preferred language is and make sure to use it when you are referencing your collections. It's up to each institution to find out what words to use. Another example of preferred language is the use of the term housing over storage. Storage can often feel sterile and impersonal, where housing indicates that they are being cared for and housed. Again, have the conversation and ask about the preferred language. There are some resources out there for language use, including the Native Governance Center's Terminology Style Guide and the Arizona State Museum's Respectful Terminology Recommended for Discussion of Human Remains. You should also know the history of the use of chemical treatments on your collections. The use of pesticides on collections may impact how culturally informed care can be implemented. Consider, is the use of pesticides on your collections well documented? What steps do you need to take to determine what has or has not been treated? It is important that you inform tribes of the use of toxic chemicals whenever you're doing consultations. Finally, how the remains are housed and classified can act as barriers to engagement. For example, oftentimes faunal remains in archaeology collections are separated by site rather than by animal family or genus. A lot of times remains are mixed, so you have species that are mixed together and are bulk stored in plastic bags. And they can even be further separated based on if individual bones or other parts of the animal were modified by humans. And then they are classified as an artifact or as an ecofact based on that. These are Eurocentric distinctions and are not necessarily meaningful or accurate from Indigenous perspectives. So with that, I'm going to provide just a quick content warning that there will be photos of animal remains on the following slides. Next slide, please. So Olson Chubbuck is an archaeology site of about 200 bison that dates to about 8,000 years ago, and it is housed at the University of Colorado Boulder. The bison skulls were housed in boxes that were too small for them, as you can see in the image on the left, or they were in these original burlap and plaster jackets that were used in the 1958 excavation, as you can see in the center image. So based on this, there were some preservation concerns, and the decision was made to rehouse them in these individually tailored fiberglass cradles to improve accessibility, which is the image on the far right. Conservationists or conversations were not initiated with tribal representatives before the project began, only after the skulls had already been rehoused, which was a lesson in appropriate procedure for those involved with this project. And of course, that lesson being, you need to involve tribes at the very beginning of the project development. It's really important to initiate these conversations really early on during the pre-planning process, because consultation and partnerships, they do provide these opportunities for more comprehensive storage planning, and it can merge the cultural and preservation concerns. So after the skulls had been rehoused, a delegation of Lakota elders came to the University of Colorado to visit and discuss the care of these animals. The elders who participated in the discussion were part of an organization called the Global Institute for Traditional Science, which is a Lakota-led science, research, and education institute. The collection was not consulted on as NAGPRA, but it was more so a conversation about how to care for the bison. And some suggestions that came from that visit included keeping the 200 bison together as a herd, as they would have been in life, and including certain plant medicine where the animals are housed. Next slide, please. Jones Miller is another bison site that I was working on while we were writing the paper. And the team working on this collection was able to implement some of the suggested steps developed for the paper toward legal, ethical, and culturally informed care. And some of those steps are written out on the right side of the slide here. At Jones Miller, the remains of about 300 bison were excavated between 1973 and 1978, and the site dates to about 10 to 11,000 years ago. The bison were originally housed at the Smithsonian and then were transferred to the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. So some of the steps that we took towards implementing care for these animals was, of course, step one was communication. Tribal historic preservation officers of tribes that are geographically and culturally associated with what is now known as Colorado were contacted before the decision was made to bring the collection back to Colorado. The tribes did not want to put in a claim on them as NAGPRA, but they were interested and supportive of the bison coming to Colorado, having them be rehoused, having research be conducted, and they wanted to know the results of any of the research done. So we ended up having to kind of skip to step 5, which was dealing with some of the historical curation choices. So as you can see in the image on the left, the bison came to the museum in these boxes with minimal padding. They were organized by skeletal element when they arrived. And so we kind of had to decide how we were going to move forward based on how the decisions were made to previously curate these animals. So coming back to step 2, we started to inventory and identify the collection. So the bison were then actually further organized by us into locality groups so that the bison that were actually found together at the site could remain together as close as possible. Step 3 was the zooarchaeological identification. So some elements were misidentified or mixed together. So we were able to reunite them. So this kind of made it helpful to actually have somebody with some zooarchaeological training on the project. Step 4, cataloging. Each individual element was individually cataloged to make the collection as accessible as possible. And finally, step 6, the care. So we were not given direct guidance from the tribes on how to care for the remains. So we approached the collection with a level of care that is not normally seen in zooarchaeological collections. Like I briefly mentioned earlier, typically animal remains are bulk bagged and cataloged into lots. We instead decided to acknowledge each individual bone, all 41,000 of them, and did things like made custom padded pillows for the long bones, as you can see in the image on the right. This is what we determined as providing the best care, but through meaningful consultation, collaboration, and partnerships, we can continue to learn and adjust our practices. So next, David, Veronica, and Shiloh will discuss a botanical case study.
Thank you, Natalie. Can we move to the next slide? I'm going to basically contextualize a different approach that was taken here at the University of Michigan over a 15 to 20 year period that's ongoing, and that there are 3 university players involved in addition to the tribes. They are the Museum of Anthropological Archaeology, the Botanical Gardens, and our university NAGPRA office. These are in completely different parts of the university system. The museum has over 4,000 seed collections from about 90 nations. And I want to state right off the bat of the immense amount of respect I have for everyone involved at all of these departments and at the tribes. And that as we move forward to new ways of respect, it's important to keep that for everyone because we're all at different places in understanding the work. Next slide, please. And that will be Veronica, who will contextualize the situations for all of us.
Ani, everybody, Veronica Passfield, Indigenous Cause, and Kanoje Conning and Doda Bendagwas. I'm Veronica Passfield, and I'm a NAGPRA officer for my tribe, Bay Mills Indian community on the southeastern shore of Lake Superior, as well as a museum consultant. I'm here today to talk to you as a museum consultant, not on behalf of my tribe. I just want to be sure that I mention that. So I've been working with NAGPRA since probably 2006 or so. A few things that I want to share with you today are in the next couple slides. So this is especially for the people who are engaged or committed or aspirational for decolonized museological practices. And my question for you, is your museum plagued by a colonial hangover? One place where I feel like we really see these sorts of old colonial practices, which are perceived by many tribal peoples as violent and linked to many other things related to extraction for us. So I put a couple of sort of diagnostic questions there and ideas for you. So the reason I included this is because for those people who sometimes are in conflict with or in tension with some of the older, more established museum folks or museum practices, I think it's helpful for you to know that museology in general is changing, and it's okay to question the way your museum has always done things and to question the way that your boss, say, or your collections manager, et cetera, does things. So very quickly, is your museum mired in institutional and or curatorial authority, control, and expertise as the primary source of knowledge? Is your museum neglectful, greedy, regressive in its collections practices? Has your museum made a poor investment in tribal consultation and expertise? Something I've seen a lot over the years is that a museum will get a great big Mellon grant and spend none of it, or a great big NAGPRA program grant and spend almost none of it on tribal consultation or in really moving their collections into consultation and return. Do your collections look a lot more like a death cult horde than something as relational and dynamic, something that like Natalie was describing? And I feel like this picture of ethnographer Frances Densmore recording a canning music song at the Smithsonian in 1915, I feel like a lot of museums are still in 1915, back with Frances. So if you don't know about her, definitely look into her. Next slide, please. What I'm here today to emphasize for you is context, context, context. So I'm sure many people on the call are familiar with the tension at American Museum of Natural History as just one example. When looking at museums, it's really important to think about the context of your institution. Okay, so there's a lot that comes at tribal representatives about, say, a site report for an archaeological site. I now do site reports on museums because a museum is a site and a museum has a history and collections have histories. So one of the primary ways that you can decolonize how your museum does things, and not everybody is going to welcome this, and this can create tension within a museum, but collections management can decolonize museums with a commitment to truth in context. Because I'm here to tell you that there are going to be a lot of tribal representatives who already know these things and who are looking at you, back at you, with these eyes and with these critiques and with these contexts. So at the very least, this is really great preparation for tribal consultation. During key collecting eras, museums expressed and enacted empire and white supremacy. American Museum of Natural History is a great way to learn about this and think about this, partially because they've done a lot of really sincere work in looking at their own history. So, for example, this Teddy Roosevelt statue has been removed, but a lot has been written about it, right? A lot of self-reflection has happened. American Museum of Natural History was also the host for the Second International Eugenics Congress in 1921, and it amassed enormous tribal collections through a very extractive Gilded Age, late Victorian era collections practices of just hoarding cultural items at a time when Native communities were dispossessed, impoverished, exploited, their treaties were ignored and broken, etc. So this is just one way that you can, one example of how you can really grapple with this with your museum, and because people like me are going to do it, so you should be ready. Next slide. Another way that we tribal representatives may contextualize some of these, for example, the seed collections, is this. There was an ethnography at University of Michigan named Volney Jones. He was out talking to his Native informants in the field. The seed amassing that happened at Michigan with Volney and subsequent seed collection. This amassing and retention was one expression of a much broader extractive colonial project that privileged collecting, academic research, and decontextualizing Anishinaabe kin obligations to seeds and one another. This is my family, and I was really kind of delighted to see this photograph of them. I did not know that this photograph existed. But I can tell you that in the Anishinaabe language, which is called Anishinaabe-Moin, our language is all language is a worldview. Within the worldview that is expressed in our language, the personhood of plants is endowed with kin relationality. So seeds and certain plants and many other things are spoken of with the same level of personhood and respect that you would give to another human being. And the person in the middle, Ada Smith, who has the white dress on, and her older sister, who's kind of pointing at the rush mat, I can't even tell you how much, I almost put in a picture of my grandmother because they look so similar. But when I look at this photo, I also feel a little bit sad because I don't know how to make those baskets. This photo was taken on Walpole Island, which is a First Nations community. I saw somebody from ROM is on our chat here. So this is a First Nations community, unceded territory. I don't know how to make rush mats. I don't know how to make black ash baskets. I don't really know a lot about seeds. So that makes me sad that my kin relationship that is expressed through our language has been severed. So this also can create not only sadness, but a challenge as you're trying to understand what your obligation is to these kin when you're implementing NAGPRA, advising, curators, et cetera. So yeah, I guess that's all I'll say about that photo. Keep going. please. One of the reasons that I don't know about this is because my great-grandmother, a child from this community, was sent to an American federal Indian boarding school. Her name was Daisy Greenbird. She attended Mount Pleasant Indian Industrial Boarding School. And if this photo has been dated properly by the Clark Historical Library at Central Michigan University, which owns it, she would have been about, they lined the kids up by size. So she would have been, one of the first 4 rows of kids back then. Daisy went to this school and was taught that who she was, her language, the way that her family collected plants, wove, mats, made baskets, everything about them was wrong and inappropriate and needed to be left behind and needed to be taken from her by any means necessary. So there really, Daisy, as far as I knew, was not really endowed with these knowledge systems and didn't pass on traditional knowledge to her daughter, who was my grandmother. And this knowledge did not continue on in my direct immediate family. Of course, these arts did survive in some families, but I'm just talking about mine. These colonial systems also extracted children in order to sever them, like we said, from their cultural riches and their knowledge, at the same time that their resources were being taken. So land in this era is being gobbled up. Treaties are being broken, timber is being harvested, copper, iron, all of the things that are needed for urbanization and industrialization in America. The source of the wealth for people like Teddy Roosevelt and other collectors at many of the museums that we're seeing here in the chat. So I'm really appreciative that we have such a diverse group coming from all over the place. The wealth that created the museums and the collections often came from the land and resources of the children in these schools and had a consequence on people like me. Okay, next slide. So another example of context and relationality, we talked about the land loss. Instead of these children, the vision of the federal government in the United States through the Indian boarding school system was that our children, kids like Daisy, would not grow up on the island, would not grow up with her family, would not grow up learning these cultural traditions. We would instead be taught to be servants and underclass wage laborers working for the wealthy families whose wealth was based in our resources. Instead of being with our families, we would be, ironing clothes for the wealthy households of America. This is the origin story of museums and collections. This is the origin story of museums and collections. Our thriving as Native people requires the restoration of kin relationships. We now hold a promise of decolonized museums and liberatory collaboration right now in this moment. We're in a really beautiful moment right now. So I want to encourage you all to be bold and to be knowledgeable about what you do. And even if your institution or people that your colleagues try to hold your museum back and their practices back, keep pushing, because we've made a lot of progress in the last 10 years especially, and we can keep it going. Next slide. I think that's my last slide. Oh, one great example, and this is just a visual for you, that if you want a sense of the scale of the resources and the profundity of what I'm describing beyond Indian boarding schools, I thought it would be interesting to quickly show you this Gilman map of our sacred mound structure outside of Detroit on the Detroit River. Gilman came in, he's very well known. He's, took those mounds down, and his items are in a lot of museums, a lot of the Peabody museums and others, and including the University of Michigan. this became the Ford Rouge plant, right? So this is a visual of what the scale of the extraction happened. And we're still dealing as NAGPRA officers with these mound items that are still being reported by museums as a part of their collection, and what should they do. So these stories that I'm talking about are very present now. We are still dealing with this extraction, and it's hard. So please support this work. I think that's my last slide. Okay. So just kind of inspiring you, being a change agent can be hard. Seeds can be NAGPRA eligible, right? So even though we're talking about beyond NAGPRA, consultation will determine if something is NAGPRA eligible. And NAGPRA isn't your only tool. Deaccessioning is a legitimate, increasingly common pathway that I'm seeing with museums now as a NAGPRA officer. So be expansive in your work.
Miigwech, Veronica.
Mm-hmm.
I'm David Michener, the curator for 35 years here at the University Botanical Gardens. I had no training in ethnobotany or any of this. The picture on the left is part of our natural areas for which I was curator. We have about a third of the native flora of the Great Lakes in situ on the various properties here in Washtenaw County. And one of the things I was trying to do, as we do for our quote exotic collections, is establish some connectivity with the places of origin. Only here, rather than being researchers at another academic institution in Asia or Europe, was how do we approach Native Americans to do this? I started this more than 25 years ago for our natural areas and came up with it. Big Red could not go anywhere. And it turned out that what it was that something called NAGPRA existed. I didn't even know about it. Why would a curator of a botanical garden know about NAGPRA? Part of why we're here. So the woman on the right, Elder Sydney Martin, asked at a NAGPRA meeting to which I had been present, and I already knew about the Ethnobotanical Museum, and she asked if any of the tribe's Mins, the seeds, go back to the language, the Mins are here because they needed to come home too. And this is where we could state, yes, there are over 4,000, and she wanted to know, well, how many are ours? These are all really great questions. But she also said, you cannot work with Indigenous students on this because we don't know if your museum is another deception, just like the boarding schools. Next slide, please. I knew squat about boarding schools. We all have to learn about our institution. I didn't know the University of Michigan is a treaty-established state university with obligations to the signatory tribes, that many of the tribes were removed. And the current map of where the 14 tribes, 12 federally recognized, are in the state, do not give me as a curator any sense of how to go and find the relatives. That's going to have to mean that it has to be consulted. It's one of these things about how do you do this? And when I first started out, I was given the very good advice or admonition of, David, you look like an anthropologist. I'm a botanist. And you coming and asking for advice is a lot like a guy in post-war Germany going to Israel and going, hi, I'm from the Adolf Hitler Botanic Garden. Fred Mathai of the Mathai Botanical Gardens was one of the most toxic persons in the university's history as far as the relation. How do we go forward? Does this sound familiar to you? We've all been here, and this is how we're working our way forward. Next one, please. And I'm the curator of peonies, and I work on peony viral genomes and all that. This is not where I was, quote, starting off on. So one of the things we worked on was something called an Indigenous Collaborative Garden, which Shiloh will talk about more in a moment. And one of the pre-planting pictures on the left, it's all about seeds. But we came with a very different way than what you saw in the bison case, working with the 14 tribes of Michigan and the NAGPRA, which also handles NAGPRA issues. We thought that the thing we most need is an agreement between the regents of the University of Michigan and the NAGPRA leadership, the tribal leadership of the state, for some key ethical behaviors. Notice I say the regent, no university, and it is signed, and it's 3 years, and it daylights and gets renewed. No university president, no museum director, no faculty member, no curator can abrogate it. It is by the highest legal authority of the state. And what we have here in green is the re-signing of it that was done this season with two of the museum staff, Jim and Andrea, also here as part of the witnessing. Respect and engagement all around. Out of this also comes the CBIC's roles, but that's can go to Q&A. But I want to turn it over to Shiloh to talk about the meaning of the Indigenous Collaborative Garden that was envisioned out of this nearly 10-year discussion session. Shiloh, please. Next slide.
Thank you. Bonjour, my name is Shiloh Maples. I'm a citizen of Little River Band of Ottawa Indians. I'm also a Anishinaabeg seed keeper and PhD student at University of Michigan School for Environment and Sustainability, focusing on seed rematriation. And I've been involved in this work in different capacities as a community member for several years, but to kind of pick up where David left off, as many of you are probably aware of in your own institutions, these large institutions are not structured to support the slow, long-term relationship building work or the emergence of new partnership models with Native nations. But to move toward more generative partnerships, institutions have to demonstrate a long-term commitment to Indigenous communities and their futures. This requires a commitment of resources, shifting how priorities are identified and decisions are made, and creating those physical spaces that transcend any one grant project. And to provide a quick example, during those early discussions that David spoke to, tribal representatives and university staff agreed that any future projects should involve, should involve growing out the seeds, sharing information about the collection, and developing a collaborative framework based on mutually respectful partnerships. So in the spring of 2018, Mathi Botanical Gardens created the Indigenous Collaborative Garden as this dedicated and protected space for the seeds to be grown out from the collection if the communities of origin decide that's the appropriate thing to do. That spring, tribal representatives from around Michigan and staff at the university planted seeds brought by the tribe, so not from the collection. And in this pilot year, that really allowed staff to establish cooperative arrangements between the botanical gardens, campus farm staff, and tribal representatives for determining what caring for the seeds and how the collaborative work would look like in the context of the Indigenous Collaborative Garden. I want to emphasize that to date, no seed from the collection have been grown out here yet. The seeds that have left the collection have been returned directly to the tribes of origin or the lineal descendants at their direction. But seeds have been grown out in that space every year since its founding. And so while the university and tribal nations have continued these conversations about the return of seeds back to their communities of origin, the Indigenous Collaborative Garden has remained a space to foster collaboration and relationships between the university and tribal nations through seed grow outs, community programming that's completely led by Indigenous community partners like myself, and support, like fiscal support and other support from the gardens. So the gardens really, and others at the university really are, shifting resources, shifting power to support the priorities identified by the tribal nations. Next slide, please. So currently through Mathi Botanical Gardens, alongside the College of Menominee Sustainable Development Institute, through the Center for Braiding Indigenous Knowledge and Sciences, is partnering with one of the Native nations whose seeds are a part of the ethnobotanical collection at University of Michigan in a year-long project that's really aimed at connecting them with their community with the seeds that were from their community. And the research team includes David, myself, the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer from our partnering community, but it's also engaging tribal leaders, local seed keepers, archivists, and collection managers, and archaeologists from a nearby military base, as well as natural resource specialists from within and beyond the tribal nation. So it's a really diverse group of folks from both different disciplines, but also many different worldviews. And together we're braiding our different worldviews and knowledges to develop research questions, determine methodology, and interpret data together. And our initial aim for the project was really to reconnect the seeds with their community of origin simply by making the community aware of the seeds and the field notes, because many of the communities whose seeds are here are unaware that they are even a part of this collection. And so after we reconnected them, we simply asked the community, what are your priorities and what do you think should be done with the seeds and the field notes? And what questions do you have about the collection? So far, the project has involved archival research to identify all of the tribe's seeds and other plant kin, the related field notes, and any other related items across the university's collections. And although this project is still ongoing and the full impact is yet to be seen, I can see that reconnecting communities with their seed kin is aiding in cultural preservation, their food sovereignty work, environmental restoration efforts within the tribal partners' territory. It's also helping to reawaken community memory regarding intertribal seed trade and more. So although we're working with one community, it's actually starting to have a impact of them reaching out and connecting with surrounding communities. So within the institution, this collaborative work has led to discussions of how to shift policy to better support these generative partnerships. And that's still ongoing work, but it's very exciting to see these transformations taking place across the institution and really consider what knowledge making and other possibilities are possible because of these new relationships that are forming. With this, I'll hand it, I think, back to our hosts.
Thanks, Shiloh, and many thanks to all of our speakers for those great presentations and for sharing our perspectives and experiences. We will now move into the Q&A portion of the program, and joining the panel here are Chance Ward, who is the NAGPRA coordinator for History Colorado and also the primary author on the paper that Natalie had discussed in her presentation. And also joining is Kate Compton-Gore, who serves as NAGPRA training coordinator for the National NAGPRA program. And helping moderate the discussion are two members of our planning committee, Trina Roberts and Breda Zimkes. Trina is the Associate VP for Collections at the Natural History Museums of LA County and also serves as the current NSCA Vice President. And Breda is Director of Collections Operations at the Harvard Museum of Comparative Zoology and co-chairs the Spinach Legislation and Regulations Committee, or Legs and Regs Committee. Trina and Breda, I hand it off to you.
All right, thanks to all the presenters for those amazing examples. Several of you mentioned the scale of the work, and it's obvious how much time and effort and energy you and your collaborators and colleagues have put into it. And we know many of our participants today are in museums with many objects and many kinds of objects and many potential tribal relationships to build and much extensive and long-term relationship building to do. And that can seem overwhelming. So what's one first step you would recommend to the audience if they want to get started, whether that's an action step or a learning step or something else? And that's for anybody who wants to have an answer to that.
I'm going to jump on this one. I love that question, and I love the spirit of that question. So one thing I will caution you is that NAGPRA officers are getting inundated now with the new regs, right? And new questions about duty of care because museums, I feel, have decisively made a turn towards decolonizing. That's also going to mean a lot of outreach for tribal reps. So sometimes it takes us a long time to get back to you. Don't give up, right? Just keep politely asking, give us a couple months, try again. Another great thing to do is to come to where we are And I know that budgets are tight, especially right now, but come to us. Um, and the third thing that I would say is, in the meantime, while you're waiting for us, learn about yourself. That's the one thing that I always recommend to museums. Learn about yourself. How is it that you came to possess this item? Who are the collectors? Who, and it's this context concept that I've been talking about. You know, look at your own founding. Look at the land that you're on. What are the treaties? And one place I'll put a link in there, but I really do appreciate what the San Diego Museum of Us has done in terms of articulating their basically kind of manifesto for decolonizing. I think that they do a really good job. And I really do like what American Museum of Natural History is doing in terms of understanding things like the statue and their role in the eugenics movement. So start with yourself. Miigwech.
David?
Veronica's absolutely right. Go there. Never ask a tribal group to come and consult with you the first time. If you don't have the priorities and the resources to go there, then what are you talking about? And yes, there are 90 some tribes involved in the Museum of the Ethnobotany Lab, and I'm a curator here at the Gardens, not there. But find the resources. It's all about prioritizing. Furthermore, if it's a really meaningful work relationship, as I grab something, don't just make it work. Take your own time and money and go there. At one of the powwows I went to, there was an early morning canoe race for 2 miles, and I wanted to see what's going on. And they were short one guy. So it's like, well, I can paddle for a couple miles, and my goals are we're not going to be last, and I don't want to capsize the canoe. And I got a t-shirt, that be human, not just professional.
Thank you so much. So Kelly had actually asked that question that Trina brought up. So she's asking another question. How can non-natives who already believe that they know Native communities make themselves vulnerable to learn? So many times Native curators and museum workers are dismissed by white colleagues, even when the white colleagues believe that they are supporting Native communities and practitioners. How can non-Native museum employees know if they are doing that to their Native colleagues?
I'll jump in again. So I just want to tell you that, I got a PhD from University of Michigan. I almost got kicked out of my program with six figures in student loan debt because I was doing NAGPRA activism because my university was in violation of some of the core tenets of NAGPRA. And there was very powerful faculty who did not appreciate that we were questioning their research collections, right? So it's horrible. Oh my gosh. And Kelly Fayard is on the chat, somebody from our Native grad student cohort who can say anything she wants there in the chat. So she was definitely a part of that. And I was in American Studies. She was in Anthro. So it was harder for her. So I think that people's spirit comes through and it can take a little while, right? I think it's okay if you're worried about one of your Native colleagues who generally are going to have some hardship around this effort. Go get tea. Talk about your families. Talk about what made you want to be in this field, and just be a good person and a friend and an ally, and things will really flow from there. I think if Kelly has other ideas, she can throw it in the chat too.
To add to what Veronica was saying, I'm gonna say the scary words right now, which are diversity, equity, and inclusion. So of course, I mean, you have to look at yourself. You do have to look at your institution. You have to look at yourself as an individual and kind of try to see where these patterns or biases are happening. And I mean, have those honest conversations too, and ask your Indigenous colleagues, like, do you feel safe and comfortable at work in your workplace? What would make you feel more safe and comfortable in your workplace? What are things that we can do to make sure that that's happening? And if you, as a non-native, employee are seeing your Indigenous colleague being treated differently, like, again, have a conversation with them, say, hey, I noticed this. Do you feel comfortable if I step in next time? Can I provide you some backup? So, just be aware of what's happening in your workplaces.
Right, so we have a question from Marjorie Leggett. Museums and botanic gardens provide education opportunities for all peoples in the U.S. Having collaborated with several museums and botanic gardens, I'm concerned how repatriation depletes a visual and research repository and possibilities for both non-native and native researchers, educators, students, and the general public. Can anybody address that? David
I
has
would love to start, actually, David, if you don't mind.
Dan's going to start.
This reminds me of the 1980s when NAGPRA was being legislated, and there were tremendous fears that the tribes would bring semi trucks to the loading docks of museums and empty out the shelves. And that has not happened. It's been 35 years, and the actual opposite has happened. The museums have been enriched, as evidenced by the presentations you've heard today. They have not been depleted, but they have been enriched through the relationships that have developed between the museums and the communities through co-curation and interpretation and exhibit.
David, did you have anything else
Thank
to
you,
add?
Jan. And I just wanted to add, it's generative work. The tribe may want to have the seeds remain here for a period of time. They may want them to be taken home and perhaps some even grown out. It's about the relationship rather than the thing. And the concern about visual depletion to me, and I'm just going to be direct, I've been a botanic garden. I've been working in university botanic gardens since 1974. You do the math. I'm concerned that when someone asks about visual representation, it reminds me of Nazi stolen art, my own partial immersion in the then Soviet museum world about how to understand the cultural meaning. If something is stolen, you have no right to exhibit it. Our agreement with the regents is that the tribes or the community of origin or the lineal ascendant own the intellectual property of the seeds that are grown. If they own the DNA, what are we doing holding it? And I just ask that back to any one of you who's concerned about loss. Is the generative future requires on the resharing, the transparency and the trust. And that's where the relationships come. If you want to do an exhibit with it in the future, time to go back to tribal council and ask what are ways to be doing something together. That's it, not owning it. That's what Veronica was talking about, the colonial hangover, the control. And I don't mean that as a personal attack. I just mean it as a framing of the question.
David, I want to just jump into and just quickly say what do you, because you and I have talked about this a lot, what do you have if you have just an amassing a hoard of seeds that are and botanical sheets and things, what is that collection absent any kind of context? What do you have? I feel that you have, it's a, that you have a death cult, that your museum, your collection is a death cult. The argument that I would recommend a museum making is why would we would obviously rather have seeds that are losing viability to completely deny ourselves the rich expertise of indigenous communities who have, managed these plants and these seeds for millennia. Why would we deny ourselves that just to kind of have this Noah's Ark, dead collection? So I'm kind of putting you on the spot here, but that's where my mind goes when we talk about that concept.
We do have a question about whether there are certificate programs or low-cost resources for emerging museum professionals to learn NAGPRA regulations. Kate, I don't know if you can talk about some of the resources that there might be out there to learning more about NAGPRA. I don't know about any kind of anything beyond what's on the website, but maybe you know.
Sure. I can talk about what the National NAGPRA program has. We have a variety of webinars that we give. We give webinars monthly, almost monthly. Our next series will start next year. But those webinars are now found on our YouTube channel. Jyotsna, if you would like to provide the webpage, it's nps.gov/NAGPRA. And there are a lot of resources on that webpage that are free and easy to access in terms of training. I also, I'm happy to, if you wanted to give out my email, I'm happy to answer any questions that may come up that are specific to the NAGPRA regulatory process, and I can answer those. I will have to jump off here soon. And I see Jan has her hand up. There are a lot of additional opportunities and resources for different trainings on the NAGPRA regulations.
Yes, thank you, Kate. In addition to the trainings on the National NAGPRA Program's website, of which we've recorded several, the National Preservation Institute, npi.org, offers NAGPRA trainings, as does Beloit's Center for Collections Care, Beloit College C3 program. And I'll put links to those in the chat. And then there's also the InStep program, which I believe is currently taking applications.
So I'm going to try to mash together a couple of different questions that we have about fossils and paleo kinds of collections, which didn't make it into our case studies, but are obviously also of interest in this conversation. Any suggestions for museums or staff who are looking at potentially repatriating or discussing ancient animal remains or minerals or other similar kinds of objects from deep time, possibly collected in the very large period of time before recognition of tribal sovereignty by the US government? Some of these collections in US institutions have been there for a very long time. How does one get started with that kind of collection?
I'd like to, if I
Go
may.
for it, Veronica, thanks.
So nobody understands deep time more than tribes. We are deep time personified. There is a 9,000-year-old cultural site in Michigan that we're dealing with right now, and we have an Anishinaabe name for that place. So we're here for the deep time conversation, right? And I think I love that question, and I love that you're thinking about it. And we may have something to offer you, a perspective around that deep time place and all of that. So I think being open to the conversation is great. Seeking the conversation is great. So I think I like where you're coming from there. And again, it's just a matter of, developing relationships with tribes, which can be hard. And I guess I go back to the things I already said about, reaching out, being patient, coming to us, offering resources about that, about your collection. So thank you.
David, do you have something to add?
I have something to add, but if Chance or Natalie want to go first, that's fine.
I can go. Yeah, I think about the same question myself. I'm born and raised in South Dakota, and we have stories about dinosaurs and monsters from a long time ago, and that's kind of reflected in fossils that come out of the Badlands. So I think working with your tribal partners, with your TIPO offices, and I think getting to talk about oral stories that kind of strengthen what those items are and stories around them. I talk about Sue the T-Rex all the time because she was found on my reservation. So I used to joke that I was going to figure out a way to culturally affiliate Sue so that we can get her back.
Natalie, anything before I have a comment?
I mean, you don't know until you ask. You have to ask. So that'll be my contribution. And David, you go ahead.
Veronica and I go back 20 some years here, to when I was a middle-aged guy. What's the language? I don't speak Anishinaabe and have since learned that plants being in the earth are addressed, some plants are addressed as spiritually animate and some are not. But to my surprise, as a Western trained natural scientist field biologist, rocks are always grandparents. And so rocks have personhood. Now, that's Anishinaabe culture. I don't know how it applies to anyone else. And it gets to what Natalie's asking and what you go and ask. Just say, this is what we have. What's appropriate? And what's the time frame for addressing it? Seeds have an urgency because seeds are potentially living in the sense of they can be regenerated without the use of genomic tools. That is, on their own, they're still enzymatically competent from a Western perspective. They can be awakened. I would bet that some of the fossils are just as impersonified as they were when they were removed. So again, it's back to ask. And this is what my point early on is. The records only tell us how we understood what we classified when we extracted it into the Western Academy. It doesn't put the relationship back or give us a map to the relationships. Back to asking elders. And then learning, how do you even ask an elder? I knew nothing about tobacco or ASEMA protocols. Boy, have I learned.
We have a somewhat specific question about whether any of our panelists who have experience with housing seeds have tried to grow out collections that were imported and required USDA APHIS permits. And on those permits, the applicant must answer, will any of the plant material be planted or grown in the US? And do you intend to release the plants or plant progeny from quarantine? This person is supportive of this work, but they need the permits to import the plants, so that could make it difficult. So if anyone has any comments on that.
I've dealt with the APHIS in my other role in the past of working with basically pharmaceutical chemistry in a different part of my career. Right now, I don't engage with APHIS at all. And in the last several weeks, it's become problematic to get anything through the Department of Commerce Trump administration permit system. I would try to be working on what's where, who do you need to contact, and at some point there may be sanity again. But right now, this is just me speaking coming out of a 2-hour-long meeting about import-export control under new regulations out of this administration. You can only push cooked spaghetti so far. Sometimes it needs to dry out again.
We have a question about international repatriation and whether any of you are aware of international or intercontinental repatriation of non-human organisms, particularly of type, although I think in any sense would be welcome to answer. Jan?
There is an international repatriation organization that has formed and is holding regularly scheduled meetings. I'm not aware of the particulars of that instance, but I would encourage you to join the international repatriation group so you could pose your question to them. I will try to find the link and share it in the chat.
Thanks, Jan. That'd be helpful.
We have one last question about, oh, it disappeared. It went into the answered section. Does anyone have advice on how to approach building tribal relationships when we bear the name of an inherently problematic figure? I wouldn't blame anyone for not wanting to engage because of this, but since changing the name is outside of their authority, they don't want to completely prevent us from doing this kind of work. David, you're suggesting to do this offline, maybe. Do we have any other questions for our panelists?
Just wanted to say I want to do it offline for the detail, not because of the fear of what anyone would see.
I can quickly also recommend acknowledging that this is problematic is really helpful. It's a great place to start relationship building, to just directly address it.
There is a question in the chat, Rita, about fossils. Where do fossils fall then when on lands administered federally, not sovereign lands? Do they fall under NAGPRA?
So federal agencies must comply with NAGPRA if it's a new discovery, a discovery that occurred on or after November 16th, 1990. The federal agency should engage in consultation with the tribes who have an interest in that land base in order for the tribes to determine if NAGPRA may apply. If it's a fossil in a collection already that was removed prior to NAGPRA, then the same situation would be recommended. Engage in consultation so that the tribe may determine if the fossil is covered by NAGPRA.
Am I allowed to jump in as an answerer as well? For museum colleagues out there, if you have fossils in your collection that are not owned by your museum but are owned by the federal government, which is common for materials from, say, BLM excavations, it may not be the museum's responsibility. You may need to have a conversation with the agency first. You may not be able to do anything directly with the tribes, and that can be either frustrating or helpful depending on the circumstances of the individual case. And that's also true for some kinds of international fossil repatriations. So the details are going to matter a lot of what you have and who kind of owns it in the museum accession sense, and which may be different than the kind of ethical or moral sense.
Thank you, Trina, for adding that. Yeah, and under the updated regulations, all museums were required to provide information to the National NAGPRA program and the federal agency that has control about all collections that are under federal control. So you had to do a report on collections under federal control, submit it to the agency and to the National NAGPRA program. And those were due in January, but it's not too late to do that. And that was under NAGPRA. So those were items that are cultural items or are human remains. But of course, you don't know what a cultural item is until you've consulted. So it's a little bit of a catch-22, but it's definitely, I think, worth alerting the federal agency and the National NAGPRA program of the collection, whether or not you know that it is a cultural item.
All right, I think we've addressed all the questions, so I'm just going to take a minute to just show my screen again to everybody. Thank you all again for joining and for staying for an extra few minutes so we could address all the questions. We will post the recording of this online and share it with everybody via email. I do want to take a minute to just ask everybody to fill out our feedback survey. This will just help us inform future events and identify topics of interest, whether related to repatriations directly or indirectly. We would love to know more about what you all are interested in so we can try to address those issues in future educational webinars. Again, we will look out for an email from us. We'll share the slides and everything after this, but I did put the link to the survey in the chat, and I will share that in a follow-up email as well. And again, please feel free to contact us at the listed email addresses here. If you have any further questions, we'd be happy to try to address them. Thanks again to all our speakers, the moderators, as well as the rest of the planning committee, as well as you all for joining the program today and for asking great questions. Thank you all and have a great rest of your day.